The harsh desert wind swept clouds of red dust across the empty streets of Durango as Judge Nathan Carter descended from the stagecoach, his black coat billowing in the dry autumn breeze. The mining boom town had sprung up seemingly overnight, its hastily constructed wooden buildings already weathered by the relentless sun and sandstorms. Carter adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, taking in the chaos of miners, merchants, and drifters crowding the town's single muddy thoroughfare. Several townsfolk paused to study the newcomer, noting his Eastern clothes and the heavy leather briefcase he carried. At 45, Carter's face bore the dignified lines of experience, though his eyes retained a sharp intensity that spoke of unwavering determination. He had accepted this appointment to the Territorial Circuit Court with a clear mission: to bring order to a region where gold fever had dissolved the bonds of civilization. The sound of breaking glass and angry shouts drew Carter's attention to the Golden Nugget Saloon. Two miners burst through the swinging doors, fists flying in a drunken brawl over claimed stakes or card games. It hardly mattered which. What mattered was that no proper court existed to settle such disputes legally. The town's current law enforcement consisted of Marshal Luke Lopez, who Carter had heard took a generous cut from local criminal enterprises. Inside the Imperial Hotel, Caroline Allen greeted the judge with a tired smile. The widow had converted her late husband's mercantile into the town's only reputable lodging house, struggling to maintain standards of decency amid the growing disorder. "We've been expecting you, Your Honor," she said, leading him to a surprisingly well-appointed room. "Though some folks weren't exactly celebrating when they heard you were coming." That evening, Carter sat at his room's small desk, reviewing territorial statutes by lamplight. A knock at the door revealed Eleanor Nelson, the town's newspaper editor, a striking woman in her 30s who had built the Durango Herald from scratch. "Judge Carter? I thought you might want to know what you're walking into," she said, producing a thick folder of documents. "I've been gathering evidence of corruption for months, but no one's been willing to act on it." The papers detailed an elaborate network of bribes, extortion, and theft, reaching from Marshal Lopez up through the territorial offices. Mining claims were routinely stolen through forged documents, honest prospectors driven off their strikes by hired thugs. Carter's jaw tightened as he read witness statements describing how Joshua Hall, the territorial commissioner, personally profited from the chaos while blocking all attempts at reform. At dawn, Carter stood before the newly constructed courthouse, a frontier temple of justice built more with hope than skill. He watched as Caleb Allen, Caroline's teenage son, nailed up notices announcing the establishment of regular court sessions and the appointment of Isaac Nelson, Eleanor's brother, as the town's first proper sheriff. Already a crowd was gathering, their reactions split between relief and barely concealed hostility. Marshal Lopez appeared on horseback, his deputy flanking him. The marshal's face was a study in barely contained rage as he read the notice. "Mighty ambitious plans, Judge," he drawled, fingering his gun belt. "But this here's complicated country. Man could get himself hurt trying to change things too fast." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, but Carter merely nodded politely and continued his preparations. That afternoon, while reviewing mining claims in his temporary office, Carter discovered the first attempt on his life: a stick of dynamite wired to his chair, poorly hidden by an amateur. The message was clear: powerful forces wanted the status quo maintained. But as he carefully dismantled the explosive, Carter smiled grimly. If they thought such crude tactics would deter him, they deeply misunderstood the man they were dealing with. Letters arrived from Tucson warning Carter to abandon his post, followed by telegrams from Pueblo suggesting he'd be wise to ignore certain irregularities in the territorial administration. Each threat only strengthened his resolve. He had not come to Durango seeking an easy post, but rather a chance to prove that justice could take root even in the most hostile soil. As night fell over the town, Carter worked by lamplight, building his cases methodically. Eleanor's investigative reports provided the foundation, but he needed more. Tomorrow he would begin hearing testimony from miners who'd been cheated, from merchants forced to pay protection money, from honest citizens who had watched their town descend into lawlessness. The law was coming to Durango, whether the powers that be liked it or not. The morning sun cast long shadows across Durango's dusty main street as Carter made his way to the makeshift courthouse he'd established in an abandoned mercantile. The building's weathered facade bore testament to the town's rapid rise and equally swift descent into lawlessness, but its sturdy stone walls would serve his purpose. Eleanor had arranged for witnesses to begin arriving at 9, and already a small crowd had gathered outside. Inside, he found Charlotte, his newly appointed clerk, organizing stacks of affidavits and witness statements. The young woman had proven herself invaluable, bringing order to the chaos of legal documents while maintaining absolute discretion. Her father had been killed in one of the mine cave-ins that the territory's corrupt inspectors had failed to prevent, giving her a personal stake in seeing justice done. As Carter reviewed the morning's cases, Joshua, his most trusted deputy, entered with troubling news. 2 key witnesses had disappeared overnight. Miners who'd been prepared to testify about the systematic theft of claims by the Territorial Land Office. Their boarding house rooms had been ransacked, but there was no sign of violence. Carter knew this was just the beginning of the opposition's efforts to silence those brave enough to speak out. The desert wind carried dust through the courthouse's open windows as the first witness was sworn in. Isaac Miller, a grizzled prospector with calloused hands and honest eyes, recounted how territorial officials had conspired with certain mine owners to falsify surveys and steal legitimate claims. His testimony was detailed and damning, naming names that reached all the way to Pueblo's territorial offices. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, but Carter pressed on. Eleanor slipped into the back of the courtroom, her notebook in hand, documenting every word. As a reporter for the newly established Durango Herald, she understood that a public record of these proceedings might be their best protection against the forces trying to suppress the truth. Her articles had already caught the attention of newspapers in Tucson and Wichita. During the afternoon session, Rose Thompson, widow of a murdered shopkeeper, took the stand. Her quiet dignity as she described the protection racket that had destroyed her husband's business moved many in the courtroom to tears. Carter noticed Joshua's hand tightening on his rifle as she named the corrupt sheriff who had orchestrated the extortion scheme. As the sun began to set, Carter received word that riders had been spotted approaching from the direction of Pueblo. Joshua's scouts reported they were led by Nathan Blake, the territorial marshal known for his flexible interpretation of the law. Carter knew Blake's arrival would force a confrontation he'd hoped to delay until more evidence was secured. In his chambers that evening, Carter met with Eleanor and Charlotte to prepare for the coming storm. They worked by lamplight, organizing depositions and creating duplicate records to be hidden in multiple locations. If anything happened to the originals, the truth would survive. Eleanor's press contacts in Wichita had agreed to publish everything if necessary. The night grew deeper as they worked, and occasional gunshots in the distance reminded them of the lawless elements still controlling much of the town. But Carter saw determination in the faces of his allies. Charlotte's steady hand never faltered as she transcribed testimony, while Eleanor's sharp mind helped connect seemingly unrelated pieces of evidence into a coherent picture of corruption. Outside, Joshua had positioned trusted deputies at strategic points around the courthouse. They were loyal men, carefully chosen and vetted, who understood that their stand for justice might cost them everything. The desert night grew cold, but they maintained their vigil, knowing that tomorrow would bring either a significant victory for law and order or a desperate battle for survival. As midnight approached, Carter studied the map of territorial mining claims spread across his desk. The pattern of corruption was clear: a web of false registrations and forged documents that had allowed certain officials to steal millions in mineral rights. But proving it in a way that would stand up in court, while keeping his witnesses alive long enough to testify, would require all his skill and determination. A flicker of lamplight caught Carter's attention as Charlotte appeared in his doorway, her face drawn with concern. "Judge, Nathan just rode in from Durango with urgent news," she said quietly. "The Territorial Marshal's office has issued papers questioning your authority to hear these mining cases. They're claiming jurisdiction should be transferred to Tucson." The judge's weathered fingers traced the complex web of claim boundaries on the map before him. This latest development was predictable. The corrupt officials weren't about to let their scheme unravel without a fight. "Tell Nathan to come in," he replied, already formulating his response to this latest challenge. As Nathan entered, trail dust still coating his denim jacket, Carter noted the young deputy's obvious exhaustion from the hard ride. But there was something else in his eyes. A haunted look that suggested he'd seen more than just legal papers during his journey. "There's more, Judge," Nathan said, removing his hat. "Isaac Thornton was found dead outside Pueblo yesterday, throat cut. He was supposed to testify about the claim jumping at the Sullivan mine. The summer heat shimmered across the dusty streets of Pueblo as Judge Nathan Hall strode purposefully toward the newly constructed courthouse. The modest wooden building represented his greatest achievement since arriving 6 months ago, a permanent symbol of law and order in this chaotic silver mining town. His boots kicked up small clouds with each step, a constant reminder of the harsh desert environment that bred both desperation and lawlessness in equal measure. Behind the courthouse's fresh-painted facade, Nathan found his clerk Caroline Lopez already at work, her dark hair neatly pinned as she organized the day's docket. 3 claim disputes this morning, Judge, she reported efficiently, and the arraignment for Joshua Carter on charges of assaulting the Wells Fargo agent. Nathan nodded gravely, knowing Carter's case would be the true test of his authority. The man had powerful friends among the mining corporations. Sheriff Luke Allen burst through the door, his usual composure notably rattled. Judge, there's trouble at the Silver Eagle mine. Isaac Nelson claims Caleb Hall jumped his claim, brought in armed men to run off his workers. Nathan's heart sank. Caleb was his own brother, and this would force a public reckoning with family loyalty versus judicial impartiality. The entire town would be watching how he handled this explosive situation. Eleanor Carter, the accused man's wife, waited on the courthouse steps with quiet dignity. Her presence was a reminder of how deeply these legal battles cut into the community's fabric. "My husband may be rough-hewn, Judge Hall, but he's no criminal," she insisted softly. "The mining companies are squeezing out the independent prospectors, using any excuse to seize their claims. Joshua was defending our livelihood." The afternoon brought the first witnesses in the Carter case. Rose Nelson, wife of the allegedly defrauded mine owner, testified with barely contained fury about threats and intimidation. But Nathan noticed inconsistencies in her account that suggested a deeper conspiracy. The mining companies appeared to be manipulating these disputes, using the local families as pawns in their broader scheme to consolidate control. A messenger arrived from Territorial Governor Charlotte Allen in Tucson, bearing an ominously official letter. The governor, Luke's sister, expressed concerns about Judge Hall's aggressive prosecution of certain prominent citizens. The implied threat was clear: back off or face replacement. Nathan crumpled the letter in frustration, recognizing the corrupt tendrils extending from the territorial capital. That evening, as Nathan reviewed case files by lamplight, Josephine Hall appeared at his door. His sister-in-law's face was streaked with tears as she confessed that Caleb had been pressured into claim jumping by men representing the Silver Eagle Mining Corporation. They had threatened to foreclose on the family ranch unless he helped drive out independent miners. The web of corruption ran deeper than Nathan had imagined. A shot rang out in the darkness, shattering Nathan's office window. He dove for cover as more bullets splintered the wooden walls. Sheriff Luke Allen and his deputies returned fire, driving the attackers into the night. But a message had been delivered. Someone wanted the judge dead. Luke's grim expression suggested he knew more than he was saying about who had ordered the hit. The next morning, Caroline discovered financial records suggesting a massive fraud scheme. The Territorial Bank was systematically denying loans to independent miners while extending generous credit to the mining corporations. These same corporations then seized the claims when the miners defaulted. Nathan finally saw the full scope of the corruption he was fighting and understood why they wanted him silenced. By week's end, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. Joshua Carter had uncovered evidence that Governor Allen herself held secret ownership stakes in the mining companies. The Wells Fargo assault had been staged to discredit Carter before he could expose the scheme. Nathan realized he would have to risk everything, including his career and possibly his life, to bring the truth to light. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. Eleanor Carter produced letters proving that Rose Nelson was actually working for the mining interests, deliberately sowing discord between the independent prospectors. The carefully constructed facade of neighbor against neighbor was designed to hide the corporate takeover of the region's mineral wealth. As Nathan prepared for the most important trial of his career, he knew the outcome would determine Pueblo's future. Would justice prevail against the powerful forces arrayed against it? Or would greed and corruption maintain their stranglehold on the frontier? With evidence mounting and tensions rising, he could only forge ahead and trust in the law he had sworn to uphold. The courthouse in Pueblo sat like a fortress against the harsh desert backdrop, its newly whitewashed walls stark against the rust-colored hills. Nathan had spent the last 3 days reviewing depositions and preparing his arguments, knowing that the mining company's lawyers would fight tooth and nail to discredit his evidence. Eleanor Carter's discovery about Rose Nelson had been the final piece of the puzzle, but presenting it effectively would require careful strategy. The morning of the trial brought an unexpected dust storm, coating everything in a fine layer of red silt. As Nathan walked through the crowded streets, he noticed several unfamiliar faces. Hired guns brought in by the mining interests, no doubt. Their presence confirmed his suspicions that this trial would be more than just a legal battle. Joshua, his most trusted deputy, had positioned men strategically around the courthouse, anticipating trouble. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Caroline sat rigid in the front row, her face set with determination. She had risked everything to testify about the fraudulent claim jumping she'd witnessed while working as a clerk at the land office. Next to her, Isaac nervously fingered the documents that would prove the systematic theft of independent miners' claims through forged paperwork and intimidation. The defense table was crowded with expensive suits from Tucson and even Wichita, corporate lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. Nathan recognized Thomas Blackwood among them, the notorious fixer, known for bribing judges across 3 territories. But Judge Harrison, newly appointed from Durango, had a reputation for incorruptibility that gave Nathan hope. As the trial proceeded, Rose Nelson's true role became clear through Eleanor's meticulous documentation. The letters revealed a calculated campaign to pit neighbor against neighbor, while the mining companies quietly consolidated their hold on the region's richest claims. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably as the evidence mounted, particularly when Charlotte testified about threats made against her family's homestead. The afternoon brought a dramatic turn when Caleb, a former mine security officer, took the stand. Despite visible nervousness, he detailed the systematic violence used against independent miners who refused to sell. His testimony was cut short by gunfire from outside, a clear attempt at intimidation. Joshua's deputies quickly secured the building, but the message had been sent. That evening, Nathan received an unexpected visitor. Josephine, the widow of a murdered claim holder, brought additional evidence she'd kept hidden out of fear. Her husband's detailed ledger showed payments made to territorial officials, including several judges who had ruled consistently in the mining company's favor. The web of corruption reached higher than even Nathan had suspected. As the trial entered its second week, pressure mounted from territorial authorities. Nathan received not-so-subtle suggestions that pursuing the case could damage his career prospects. Anonymous notes appeared on his desk, reminding him of the fate of other reformers who had challenged the status quo. But the sight of honest miners and their families filling the courtroom each day strengthened his resolve. The defense's strategy became increasingly desperate. Character assassination attempts against key witnesses were followed by legal maneuvers to exclude crucial evidence. When these failed, more direct methods emerged. Joshua thwarted 2 attempted break-ins at the evidence room, and Caroline narrowly escaped an accident with a runaway wagon. Through it all, Nathan maintained his methodical presentation of evidence, building an irrefutable case of corruption and violence. The mining company's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as more witnesses came forward, emboldened by others' courage. Even Rose Nelson, sensing the shifting tide, approached Nathan about turning state's evidence in exchange for leniency. The desert wind howled outside the courthouse windows as Nathan prepared his closing arguments. He knew that the verdict would ripple far beyond Pueblo's dusty streets. This wasn't just about mining claims anymore. It was about whether law and justice could truly take root in the frontier. As he organized his notes, Nathan reflected on how much had changed since he'd first arrived in this harsh land, determined to build something more than just another boomtown ruled by greed and violence. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pueblo's dusty main street as Judge Nathan Hall emerged from his makeshift courthouse, his shoulders heavy with the weight of recent decisions. The territorial marshal's investigator, Luke Carter, had finally presented evidence of what Nathan had long suspected: a vast network of corruption reaching from the local mining claims office all the way to the territorial capital, with Joshua Lopez, the deputy territorial administrator, at its center. Eleanor Nelson, the judge's clerk and confidant, hurried across the street with a leather portfolio clutched to her chest. Her normally composed features were tight with worry as she whispered, "3 more claim disputes filed today, Your Honor. The Lopez syndicate is trying to overwhelm the court with fraudulent cases. Nathan nodded grimly, knowing these tactical legal maneuvers were meant to distract from his broader investigation. Inside his chambers, Nathan spread out Luke's carefully assembled documents across his desk. Property records, bank transfers, and sworn testimonies painted a damning picture. Joshua Lopez had been systematically stealing legitimate mining claims through a maze of shell companies and corrupted officials, leaving honest prospectors destitute while he built an empire of stolen wealth. The sound of breaking glass shattered the evening quiet. Nathan ducked instinctively as a bullet whizzed through his office window, embedding itself in the far wall. Eleanor screamed from the outer office, and Nathan heard the thunder of boots as his deputies rushed to respond. This was the third attempt on his life in as many weeks, but the shooter had never been so bold before. Caleb Allen, Nathan's most trusted deputy, burst through the door with his gun drawn. "Judge is secure," he shouted to the others. "Eleanor, you all right?" She nodded shakily as she emerged from behind her desk. Nathan was already at the window, studying the gathering darkness. The shooter would be long gone, leaving only questions about who had ordered this latest attempt. That night, in a secret meeting at Caroline Carter's boarding house, Nathan gathered his closest allies. Luke presented his latest findings while Caleb and fellow Deputy Isaac Nelson discussed security arrangements. Caroline, who had lost her husband to claim jumpers 2 years prior, provided crucial intelligence about Lopez's local operations gathered from her boarder's conversations. "Lopez is planning something big," Luke explained, spreading out a map marked with recent claim purchases. "These properties form a pattern. He's trying to control all access to the new Silver Strike in Thunder Canyon. But he needs your court's cooperation, Judge. That's why the pressure's increasing." Nathan traced the map with a weathered finger, seeing the cruel elegance of Lopez's scheme. A knock at the door brought hands to weapons, but it was only Eleanor with urgent news. "Joshua Lopez just arrived in town on the evening stage," she reported breathlessly. "He's called an emergency session of the Mining Commission for tomorrow morning." Nathan exchanged knowing looks with his allies. This was Lopez making his move, likely planning to use his authority to dissolve Nathan's court. The next morning dawned blood-red over the desert as Nathan made his way to the commission meeting. He had positioned his deputies carefully throughout town, knowing violence was likely once he revealed Lopez's crimes. Charlotte Hall, his daughter, had begged him to flee town instead, but Nathan knew this moment of confrontation had to come. Joshua Lopez sat at the head of the commission table, his expensive Eastern suit a stark contrast to the rough clothing of the local officials. His smile was practiced and politicians smooth as he called the meeting to order, but his eyes were cold when they met Nathan's. The judge could feel the weight of his evidence in his briefcase, knowing the next few minutes would change everything. "Before we begin," Nathan announced, rising to his feet, "I have evidence of systematic corruption and theft involving certain members of this commission." Lopez's smile never wavered, but his hand moved slightly toward his coat. Nathan caught Caleb's subtle nod from the doorway. His deputies were in position if things turned violent. The next few minutes were chaos as Nathan presented his evidence. Lopez's facade cracked as document after document revealed his crimes. When he finally drew his hidden derringer, Caleb and Isaac were ready. The shooting was brief but fierce, leaving Lopez wounded and under arrest while 2 of his allies lay dead near the commission table. In the aftermath, as deputies led Lopez and his conspirators away, Eleanor found Nathan standing alone in his chambers. "It's not over," she said softly. "His friends in the Capitol will fight this." Nathan nodded, watching dust devils dance across the street through his bullet-holed window. "Then we'll fight them, too. This territory needs honest courts more than it needs corrupt officials." Over the next days, as news of Lopez's arrest spread, honest miners and merchants began emerging from the shadows, offering testimony about years of extortion and theft. Charlotte helped Eleanor organize the flood of evidence while Luke rode dispatch to the territorial capital, carrying copies of everything in case Lopez's allies tried to destroy the originals. Rose Allen, Caleb's wife and the town's schoolteacher, opened her classroom to serve as an additional courthouse as Nathan began hearing the backlog of legitimate claims. Slowly, methodically, he started untangling Lopez's web of fraud, returning stolen properties to their rightful owners. Justice was coming to Pueblo, one case at a time. Josephine Nelson, Isaac's mother and the owner of the town's newspaper, worked tirelessly to publish accounts of Lopez's crimes, ensuring the truth spread faster than any corrupted official could suppress it. Her articles reached all the way to Washington, attracting the attention of federal investigators who began their own probe into territorial corruption. As summer faded into autumn, Nathan could finally see real change taking hold in Pueblo. Honest businesses were thriving, miners worked their legitimate claims without fear, and even the territorial government was being reformed under federal scrutiny. His dream of bringing true justice to the frontier was becoming reality, one honest verdict at a time. The autumn winds carried an uneasy chill as Nathan received an urgent message from his contacts in Tucson. Lopez's allies were mobilizing for one final desperate attempt to regain control of Pueblo. Intelligence suggested a coordinated assault was planned, targeting not just Nathan, but also Josephine's newspaper office and the makeshift courthouse where evidence of their crimes was stored. Rather than flee, Nathan decided to set a trap, knowing this could be his chance to end the corruption once and for all. Working through the night, Nathan and Isaac strategically positioned trusted deputies throughout the town, while Caroline helped evacuate civilians from potential danger zones. Eleanor transformed her schoolhouse into a fortified sanctuary where the town's most vulnerable residents could take shelter. The air grew thick with tension as dawn approached, everyone knowing that blood would likely be spilled before sunset. Just as the first rays of morning light touched Pueblo's dusty streets, riders appeared on the horizon. But Lopez's men had underestimated the town's transformation. Where once they would have found cowering citizens, they instead faced an organized resistance. Shopkeepers who had suffered under their extortion schemes now stood armed at their windows. Miners whose claims had been stolen formed a defensive line along the main street. The battle erupted with an intensity that shook the town to its foundations. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Lopez's men attempted to overwhelm Nathan's defenses. But the judge had positioned his forces perfectly, creating deadly crossfire zones that caught the attackers off guard. The courthouse became the focal point of the fighting, as both sides knew the evidence stored within could destroy the corrupt network spanning the territory. In the midst of the chaos, Nathan spotted a familiar face: the territorial marshal who had long been Lopez's primary enforcer. The two men locked eyes across the smoke-filled street, each recognizing that only one would walk away from this confrontation. Their duel became the centerpiece of the larger battle, a symbolic clash between the old order of corruption and the new dawn of justice. Josephine, refusing to abandon her printing press, continued working through the gunfire to publish a special edition exposing the final desperate acts of Lopez's organization. Her courage inspired others, and citizens who had initially sought shelter began emerging to support Nathan's forces, passing ammunition and tending to the wounded. The turning point came when a group of federal marshals, summoned by Josephine's articles, arrived from Durango just as the battle reached its crescendo. Their appearance shattered the remaining resolve of Lopez's men, who found themselves caught between Nathan's defenders and federal law enforcement. The corrupt territorial marshal, seeing his forces crumbling, attempted one final desperate shot at Nathan. But Isaac, who had positioned himself on the roof of the newspaper office, spotted the threat. His precise rifle shot saved Nathan's life and ended the marshal's reign of terror permanently. As the smoke cleared and the last of Lopez's men surrendered or fled, the town emerged into a new era. The battle had been costly, with several defenders wounded and buildings damaged, but Pueblo had definitively broken free from the corrupt system that had controlled it. In the aftermath, Nathan worked tirelessly to ensure justice was served. The evidence preserved in the courthouse led to indictments reaching the highest levels of territorial government. Caroline organized the townspeople to rebuild damaged structures, while Eleanor resumed teaching in her classroom, now proudly displaying a portrait of Nathan alongside other symbols of justice and education. Josephine's newspaper documented every detail of the battle and its aftermath, ensuring that the story of Pueblo's transformation would inspire other frontier towns to stand against corruption. The federal authorities, impressed by Nathan's success, began implementing his methods of judicial reform across the territory, creating a new standard for frontier justice. As winter approached, Nathan stood on the steps of the newly constructed permanent courthouse, watching citizens go about their daily lives without fear. The town had paid a heavy price for its freedom, but the justice he had dreamed of bringing to the frontier had finally taken root. Pueblo had become a symbol of hope, proving that even in the wildest territories, the law could triumph over chaos and corruption. Judge Nathan Carter sat in his office in Pueblo's newly constructed courthouse, reviewing the damning evidence he'd gathered against Territorial Marshal Joshua Hall and his network of corrupt officials. After months of careful investigation and documentation, the case was ironclad. The marshal's schemes of extorting mining claims, orchestrating false arrests, and profiting from the chaos had been meticulously mapped out through witness testimonies, financial records, and intercepted communications. Through the window, Nathan watched the dusty main street where just days ago another attempt had been made on his life. The third since he'd begun building his case. The assassin's bullet had left a neat hole in his office wall, but had succeeded only in strengthening his resolve. His thoughts turned to Caroline Lopez, the brave widow who'd first brought him evidence of the corruption, risking everything to expose how her husband's legitimate mining claim had been stolen through fraudulent paperwork and threats. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as Deputy Luke Allen entered, his usual easy manner replaced by obvious tension. "Judge, Marshal Hall just rode into town with a dozen men. They're gathering outside the saloon." Nathan nodded grimly. He'd expected this. Hall wouldn't go down without a fight, but the judge had prepared carefully, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Eleanor Nelson, the court clerk who'd helped Nathan piece together the paper trail of corruption, rushed in behind Luke. "The telegraph lines have been cut," she reported breathlessly. "And I saw men positioning themselves on the rooftops across the street." Her hands trembled slightly as she set a stack of documents on his desk, copies of the evidence they'd gathered, ready to be dispatched to federal authorities in multiple directions. In the growing dusk, Nathan could hear the buzz of anxious voices in the street as townspeople hurried to get inside, sensing the coming violence. He thought of how far they'd come in establishing real justice in Pueblo. Proper trials, fair enforcement of claims, protection for honest miners and merchants. He wouldn't let Hall and his thugs drag them back into chaos and corruption. Sheriff Isaac Allen, Luke's older brother and Nathan's strongest ally in law enforcement, entered through the back door, his weathered face grim. "I've got 15 deputies stationed around town, Judge. Caleb Nelson and his miners are with us too. They're watching the back streets. But Hall's brought some real killers with him. This could get ugly." Nathan appreciated the warning, but they'd known the risks when they'd started down this path. Rose Carter, Nathan's wife of 20 years, appeared in the doorway of his office. Though fear showed in her eyes, her voice was steady as she handed him his old cavalry revolver. "Whatever happens, you're doing what's right," she said softly. Nathan touched her hand briefly, grateful for her unwavering support through all the dangers and uncertainties of bringing law to the frontier. Outside, Marshal Hall's voice boomed across the darkening street. "Nathan Carter! Come out and face these charges of interfering with territorial authority." The false accusations were a desperate ploy, but Hall knew his real crimes were about to be exposed. Nathan checked his gun one final time and stood, straightening his judge's coat. "Luke, get those evidence packets to the writers waiting at the livery. Eleanor, you and Rose know where to take the rest if anything happens to me." The confrontation that followed would be remembered in Pueblo for generations. As Nathan stepped onto the courthouse porch, Hall's men opened fire from their positions. But the judge's preparations proved superior. His deputies and supporters were already in place. The ensuing gun battle lasted less than 10 minutes, leaving Hall and 3 of his men dead, several others wounded and surrendering. In the aftermath, as federal investigators descended on Pueblo, the full scope of the corruption was revealed. The territorial governor himself was implicated, along with numerous officials in Tucson and Durango. Nathan's meticulous case brought down an entire network of criminals who had been masquerading as lawmen, leading to sweeping reforms across the territory. Josephine Hall, the marshal's widow, came to Nathan's office a week later. Rather than seeking revenge, she brought additional evidence of her husband's crimes, explaining how she'd tried to stop him but had been silenced by threats. Her testimony helped ensure that justice was fully served, though Nathan ensured she kept enough of her husband's legitimate assets to live comfortably. Charlotte Allen, Luke's wife, and the town's schoolteacher later wrote an account of those dramatic days that became required reading in territorial schools. She detailed not just the violence, but the patient, methodical work of building true justice, gathering evidence, establishing fair procedures, earning the people's trust. It was a different kind of frontier tale, one of law triumphing through careful preparation rather than quick draws. Years later, when Nathan finally retired from the bench, Pueblo had become a model of frontier justice. The mining claims office ran smoothly under Eleanor's honest administration, while Luke had followed his brother Isaac's example to become a respected lawman himself. The town still faced challenges, but disputes were settled in courtrooms rather than gunfights, and corruption found no fertile ground to take root. On his last day as judge, Nathan visited Caroline Lopez's grave, remembering how her courage in coming forward had started them down this path. He left his judge's gavel there as a tribute to all those who had risked everything to replace frontier chaos with true justice. The desert wind whispered through the graves, carrying away the last echoes of the territory's lawless past. The legacy of Nathan's work in Pueblo rippled outward across the territory like rings in a desert pond. Other frontier towns began sending delegations to study how he had transformed a chaotic mining camp into an orderly community. Eleanor, who had mastered the intricacies of mining claim administration, found herself traveling to Durango and Tucson to help establish similar systems there, carrying the seeds of reform with her quiet determination. Luke, now wearing a marshal's badge of his own, often reflected on how different things were from the days when he and Isaac had first arrived in Pueblo. The old saloon where they'd confronted corrupt deputies had been replaced by a proper courthouse, its adobe walls rising proud against the desert sky. Sometimes in the evening, he'd sit on the courthouse steps with Charlotte, who had become his wife, watching their children play in the dusty street without fear. Joshua, the former territorial judge who had once tried to maintain the corrupt status quo, had eventually faced justice himself. His trial became a symbol of the new order, conducted with the same careful attention to evidence and procedure that Nathan had insisted upon for every case. When the guilty verdict came down, even Joshua's supporters had to admit the fairness of the proceedings. The desert itself seemed to have made peace with civilization's advance. The harsh landscape remained untamed, but the people who lived there had learned to work within its boundaries rather than fighting against them. Irrigation ditches followed ancient indigenous waterways, and new buildings incorporated traditional adobe techniques that kept them cool in summer and warm in winter. Rose, who had started as Nathan's court clerk and risen to become a respected legal mind in her own right, compiled his judicial decisions into a volume that became a handbook for other frontier judges. Justice in the Desert, she called it, and its dog-eared pages could be found in courthouses from Wichita to the Pacific Coast. Josephine had transformed her boarding house into a center of civic life, hosting meetings where townspeople debated issues and worked out compromises before they ever needed to reach the courtroom. The old-timers still remembered how she had sheltered witnesses during the dangerous days of reform, and her word carried weight in town councils. On the 10th anniversary of Caroline Lopez's testimony, the town dedicated a new school building in her name. Her daughter, now grown, cut the ribbon while Nathan and Eleanor looked on. The school's motto, carved in stone above the door, read, "Truth prevails in light." Words Caroline had spoken during her crucial testimony about the corrupt claim-jumping scheme. Caleb, the former deputy who had chosen to stand with Nathan against his corrupt colleagues, had trained a new generation of lawmen who viewed their badges as a sacred trust rather than a license for extortion. His academy on the outskirts of Pueblo became known throughout the territory for producing officers who knew both law and ethics. The mining industry had changed too. With clear title records and fair dispute resolution, companies were willing to invest in deeper shafts and better equipment. The boom and bust cycle gave way to steady growth, and miners' families put down roots, building permanent homes instead of canvas tents. In his retirement, Nathan wrote letters to other frontier judges, sharing his experiences and offering guidance. "The law must be as steady as the mountains and as clear as desert stars," he wrote. "When people trust in justice, they build rather than destroy, they solve rather than shoot. They look to tomorrow rather than fear today." Isaac, who had given his life defending the new order in those early dangerous days, was remembered at every Founders' Day celebration. The town had commissioned a simple bronze plaque that hung in the courthouse lobby, listing the names of all who had died bringing law to the frontier. Below the names was inscribed, "They chose justice over chaos, law over power, right over might." As the 19th century drew to a close, Pueblo stood as proof that civilization need not arrive at gunpoint. The town had found its way to order through the patient work of those who believed in law's power to transform. The desert wind still blew dust through the streets, but it no longer carried the bitter taste of fear and lawlessness.